We're live. I had a little bit of a pause there before I announced that we're live. We are joined by the Oracle of London, based in London, Alexander Mercouris, and we are joined by the one, the only, the great Mr. Robert Barnes. Robert, where can people find you real quick?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com. That's where they can find anything and everything, participate and partake in the community. It's right up there with the duran.locals.com is the best place to have interesting, fun, engaging conversations.
Best place on locals. It has exclusive content, and Robert does all kinds of great shows, including the Hush Hush show, which is you learn all kinds of very interesting things in those Hush Hush episodes that you do, Robert. Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah, well, it turned out predictive in ways that helped influence aspects of where the American debate went, as chances have it. So it's been it turned out a lot more predictive than as you gentlemen's commentary has been much more predictive than all the so-called experts we have here in the West.
And we'll discuss a lot of those predictions, Robert. And one of your predictions, before I forget, I remember the last live that we did. You said, I thought there was going to be a Biden conflict in Africa, but it just didn't happen. And about a week and a half later, Somalia. So that came true.
Africa always made more sense from the perspective. It's the Democratic pitch that one, that Rwanda is considered the great failure of the Clinton administration, not intervening and not getting involved and everything that happened. So especially within the kind of neoliberal mythology, that was the great failure of non-interventionism. And then secondly, it's a place nobody really cares about. So a lot of crazy stuff can happen. I mean, Lavrov made a joke out of it. He's like, if you're really worried about the Russia-Ukraine war, just imagine it's the Middle East, or imagine it's Africa, and you'll be able to sleep just fine. Your Lavrov commentary. But it made more practical for the deep state wants someplace they can, have their little grab bag of fun and their little money bag, because that's what the Ukraine bill really is. I mean, it's called the Ukraine bill. It's a deep state power grab and deep state money grab, black bag operation. And it's just a deep state budget. That's why almost none of it will probably end up in Ukraine with ordinary Ukrainians. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, you look at that $40 billion, you dig in, you're just like, how much are we actually spending on arms or soldiers that will actually go to the Donbass, the front lines of the conflict? It's actually pretty small out of that $40 billion.
Yeah.
Over half of it.
I heard about $6 billion out of it.
That may end up on the high side. Because what they did is they split it. $20 billion is basically for the State Department, and it's for the State Department to have fun with. Your NGOs, your favored media people. That's why I say it's really a deep, we've had these before, deep state budgets, and we called it Vietnam, or we labeled it Afghanistan, or we labeled it Iraq, and now we label it Ukraine. But you look at where the actual money goes, and there's almost no direct monetary transfer to the Ukrainian government, almost no direct guaranteed actual arms. Hey, we're going to ship this from here to here to here on this date. Now there's up to $6 billion in new defense arms that may be sent. The rest of it's basically to replenish what's already been sent over. And that's basically it really, when you dig into it, it's just a big deep state budget. Half of the Pentagon, half of the State Department. So the Pentagon figures out, okay, we'll help these defense contractors and these buddies here and this group's over here. And we'll decide how much we spend over there. Some of our trainers, I guess they're going to send a special ops unit into Kiev for, to secure the embassy. I don't know if they're really going to try, Iran 1979 all over again, but whatever. And then on the State Department side is where, 20 billion. That's a nice little chunk of change for all the little NGOs, political organizations, press organizations. But and as you noted, Alexander, part of it is to actually have Ukrainian government officials depend on that budget for their own paychecks.
Yeah.
So it's like a de facto colony. I mean, in terms of its operation, it's if you're anywhere in the Zelensky regime hierarchy and you want to get paid, you want to eat next week, you better be doing the U.S. State Department's bidding, because that's the only place where your paycheck is coming from. So but as we predicted, actually, it was even more than I thought it was going to be. We went from 6 Republican House members saying not interested to almost 60. We went from 0 Republican senators saying they were going to do something to 11 opposing it. And there were some big names in that group. There were some leadership people in the House or people that want to become leaders in the House who voted no. In the Senate, the big switch was Josh Hawley. So Hawley started out on this thing. Hawley has national ambitions. He thinks he's going to be president at some point, at least attorney general, some other things like that. And so he started off when this whole Ukraine thing calling up Zelensky and saying what a hero he was and all this lame crap. And he got blowback from some of his populist base. Nothing is a better signifier of what's happened in terms of the populist Republican base than Josh Hawley. He goes from being a big cheerleader for Zelensky in Ukraine to voting no on 40 billion, even though Mitch McConnell was going nuts about anybody voting no. And the whole deep state apparatus was bringing massive pressure on. And Alexander, the piece you mentioned earlier or emailed over about Axios, what's translating is Axios, for those that don't know, has a piece out identifying how much within Washington this anti-entanglement, anti-intervention, non-real, whether you call it neocon, neoliberal, globalist, whatever label you want to put on it, this pro-intervention mindset is being countered not only amongst the populist base in the country, showing up in more House members and Senate members opposing even money being sent over. And again, this wasn't money really being sent over. It's mostly going to be spent here, but cycled and defined as being spent for them, of course, is these think tanks. Is what's happening is you've got the libertarian wing and the populist wing. The libertarian wing has more think tank control and donor influence. The populist wing has more voter influence. But between Donald Trump, as Noam Chomsky said, being the only reasonable voice on the Ukraine issue out of the West, and you have Donald Trump Jr., who made very aggressive populist anti-entanglement intervention war speeches regarding Ukraine when he was in campaigning for J.D. Vance in Ohio. And but you add that to Peter Thiel, you add that to the Koch brothers, who have some libertarian leanings sporadically on issues of foreign policy. And you add that to some big names switching because there's been a donor switch, which is increasingly even think tanks in D.C. rely on crowdfunding, mass funding, not just big checks from big players. So like the Heritage Foundation is talking about taking a realpolitik position on war, which is against this. Mearsheimer, others. There was the debate, which had that dimwit from the Obama administration. It was actually an ambassador to Russia to say stupid stuff again, but that's another story. But what you're seeing is your article is absolutely right. You're seeing organized Washington, think tanks, staffers, political action committees, press organizations get in on supporting and institutionalizing this populist voter base that is growing louder and louder here in the States by the day, especially when we had to get foreign aid. I mean, America had to get foreign aid to feed babies. It's insane. We had, while we're, at least on paper, sending money to Ukraine, and gotta ask Europe, please send us baby formula so the babies don't starve. Not a great situation for the Biden administration right now. But if you are part of the populist right, wanting to see that grow in the anti-war, anti-intervention space, you're seeing it grow at almost record pace since the beginning of this conflict.
Robert,
before you start, Alexander, let me just say one quick hello to everybody on Odyssey, Rumble, Locals, our great locals community, YouTube. Let's just get right into it, guys. The super chats, any chats and messages that you guys send, we will put them all together at the end of the show, and we will answer everything in a dedicated show. Do not worry, we're going to answer, as we always do, all of the questions, and any questions addressed to Robert. We will get Robert. We will chase him down and hunt him down to answer those questions. Alexander, over to you. Oh, Zariel, Alan Watson, our moderators, whoever else is moderating, thank you very, very much for everything that you do. Alexander, over to you.
I just wanted to say that, Robert, you are far ahead of the curve on that one, that there would be this revolt within Congress. I can remember you saying this would happen in our previous live stream. I don't think anybody expected it. In Britain, it's come as an absolute shock. And I would add that today, I was reading in the Daily Telegraph, we have one good journalist on the Daily Telegraph, who's Ambrose Evans Pritchard. I say one good journalist. more perhaps correct to say an interesting journalist, an intelligent journalist. He's sometimes completely wrong on some things. But anyway, he's in Davos at the moment, where the World Economic Forum is happening. And he says that the people from Congress are split, that there are people from Congress, and he was careful not to say which party, but some of them are now saying that this has gone too far. And he quoted somebody called Tim Cantor, who you probably know who he is, I don't, but Tim Cantor saying that the United States is in danger of overplaying its hand. And he also quoted somebody else called Senator Christopher Combs, who apparently is also now saying that things are not going as planned. So, Robert, I don't know who these people, Cantor and Combs, are, not being the great expert on US politics. But the fact is that it's been picked up in Britain, that this shift is taking place in the US. That article in the New York Times, that editorial in the New Times, rang alarm bells here. We're very, very attuned to what is going on in Washington. Here in Britain, you must understand that the political class, all of them, read the New York Times. I mean, it's absolutely indispensable that they all know what the mood, how the wind is blowing in Washington, because we are so close in some ways, in Britain especially, to the US. And of course, we have the same language, so it's easy for us to communicate. But already you can see that in Britain, this is being picked up. People are noticing that this is happening. And if the congressional people at Davos are taking different views, well, you can be sure that this is spreading all over Davos, and and all the talks and discussions, and the cafes, the restaurants, the bars around Davos, where the World Economic Forum is taking place. They're all going to be talking about it to each other. They're going to say, America is moving, and it's not moving in the direction the Biden administration wants it to go. So, and that's now going to be relayed right across Europe. The British, as I said, picked up the New York Times article. In Davos, the continental Europeans, the Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, the French, they will all be picking it up as well.
Yeah, I think there's somebody in Davos didn't want some of those cafe conversations overheard, because they sent the local police to try to harass little Jack Posobiec, who is there covering it. And apparently, I guess the Swiss, if you're assigned to the World Economic Forum, you get your own special World Economic Forum police badge. And it doesn't look like it's not as good as a Duran symbol. Let's just put it that way. It looks more like something out of a the alternative religions. Let's call it that way. Maybe appropriate for the for the Davos crowd. But yes, you're absolutely correct. There is a split within the American deep state about the progress of the war, and some of this we've discussed before, and that there was clearly, as to Russia, some members of the deep state apparatus in the United States, most likely within the Pentagon, that were not gung-ho about escalating conflict with Russia from the get-go. That may have been part of the reason for that Biden conference with Putin all the way back, whether it was concern about Russian weapons, whether it was concern that this is a distraction from China, which is what some of them are focused on, whether some are just, enough realpolitik that they may share the agenda of isolating Russia, undermining Putin, but just don't think that's a achievable objective or worth the effort. But I think what's accelerated it is there is a great fear that that this will fail, and that this will fail badly. And so what's accelerating this divide within the deep state is those members who say, this isn't going to work out the way we want. Given that, we need to find an exit ramp now, not have a complete disaster, as embarrassing as Afghanistan was just a year ago, not as embarrassing as Vietnam turned out to be, not as embarrassing as Iraq turned out to be, not as embarrassing as Libya or Syria, or, you could argue, throw in Sudan, Somalia, Black Hawk Down, all that turned out to be. But this would be particularly embarrassing because so much was put into it. And so it was so heavy in terms of the media apparatus, in terms of the amount of money, spent on it, or at least on paper sent on it. And so the first signs of cracks, public cracks, was the New York Times editorial. But that was basically saying time to look at an exit ramp in its own way. And then the second aspect, it does tell you something about where Ukraine stands, that everybody assumes Zelensky will do whatever we tell him to do. Nobody thinks Ukraine or Zelensky is acting independently. Now, I mean, whether it was the British, whoever leaked it, that Boris's special trip there was to shut down the Istanbul agreements and accords from moving forward. But it's quite extraordinary, the assumptions made. But the deep state divide is real. It started out with the New York Times editorial, then it transitioned over to Kissinger's comments in Davos, and Kissinger's always been part of that deep state apparatus, but the more realistic, you could say. What I used to say about Kissinger is his moral compass is, I don't trust his moral compass at all, but his intellectual capabilities are not meaningfully endowed. Whereas this new generation of deep state, national security state, whatever label you want to put on it, I do have great and grave doubts about their competence. I mean, we'll discuss later the Sussman trial taking place in Washington, where the head of the United States FBI counterintelligence couldn't even tell people what his last title was. Had basic failures that people watching are like, oh my God, this guy is head of U.S. counterintelligence? No wonder Aldrich Ames had so much fun for so many years. But I mean, it's that level of ungovernable almost incompetence. But that's where the split is. The Victoria Newlands, the Kagan family, that whole crew, still gung-ho. The people that are kind of the junior varsity team, Obama's junior varsity team is what's in charge now. You got Dimwit making jokes at the Georgetown commencement proceedings, Blinken. I mean, these guys can't even help themselves. I mean, they're so out of touch with the world. They're almost like Mark Zuckerberg style looking robots when they communicate in public. You had Biden, who they can't keep on a leash because he goes off and says, yeah, we'll invade Taiwan. American military will be there right away if you get around. And then they'd say, no, we didn't really quite mean that. They had to try to walk that back as quickly as possible. So in that, when you have that context going on, I think you have a real deep divide. And Kissinger really just confirmed it in Davos. For him to go to Davos after the New York Times piece and say, we probably should be looking at this a little bit differently. Probably time. They want to exit gracefully before they get publicly embarrassed, because it could be any time now, as you mentioned before, how the battleground is going to go in a war of attrition, that things just happen suddenly. They go slow, and then sudden. It's like a cliff. Well, we've seen that over the last week. I mean, we've seen all of a sudden, nothing happens for like a week, and then in a day, 5 villages fall. And that they're clearly going to lose more and more land. And then you get this confirmed. The only time you ever see this confirmed in the West is when one of these mercenaries come back, with one of these volunteers come back. And they're like, this was not fun. This was not game of duty at all. This was sitting there watching my buddy blown up, next buddy blown up, trying to dodge. And it was like, I'm out of here. So those kind of stories give you a sense of what's happening to the Ukrainian on the front line. So the fear is, what happens if the Ukraine collapsed militarily in the East in days or weeks? That, the more Russia achieves what it wants militarily, the less willing it's going to be to negotiate diplomatically. And how embarrassing would it be for these kind of things to go? And I think there are also not only legitimate divisions within Europe, but I think the apparatus that wants an exit ramp is encouraging people like the Italians. Because all of a sudden the Italians started all talking at once. And it was like, you wonder whether they got a green light from somebody somewhere to go ahead. But, all of a sudden everybody was saying, hey, maybe we should look at getting out of this. Maybe Berlusconi was talking, everybody was talking. And they put forward a very reasonable settlement proposal. So I think and then of course the Germans and the Austrians are nervous about the economic impact. But it's definitely, we have a definite deep state divide with people like Coons. I mean, Coons is an old school establishment senator. Very close and very tight with Biden. He would be representing the fact that he's saying anything at all that's the word that things are not, means that there's a part of the deep state or the part of the interventionist apparatus that doesn't want this to continue on the path it's going. And they think the only exit is not the exit that apparently the Poles are thinking about, bringing back all Polish-Lithuanian part of Ukraine. They're like, let's just pretend that all you Poles are now Ukrainians. Apparently, they're going to be able to vote and run office.
I know.
And it looks like a map. Like, I think there's two exit maps. One exit is whatever could get done right now. And the later exit map, not only is it an embarrassing deep state disaster for U.S. foreign policy, because all these military strategic intel experts are going to be embarrassingly wrong for the whole world to witness. Everything the State Department said, everything that was both externally and to some degree internally has been communicated. All these people are going to be embarrassed and humiliated if this goes the way it's going currently. If they have a current exit ramp, everybody saves face. And the people who want to reshift to China and focus on other things, they win too, because they just don't see this as a big battle. But that split is a real split, and you're seeing it, and you're probably going to see more and more of it. You'll see another House member here, somebody that's a surprising source, say, well, maybe we should maybe we should look at that because of this, because otherwise, I mean, I was looking at an old, there's a YouTube video that does Ukraine all the way from beginning of the time, basically, as to what their ethnic makeup was and who governed different parts of the country. And if you just stopped somewhere in the middle of the 16th century, you could find a part where almost everything other than what was Lenin gave Ukraine in 1922. So if you take Kharkiv down to Odessa and you carved that out and you gave it to Russia, and the rest you gave to Poland, there's actually maps that look that way for Ukraine in the 15th and 16th century. There were the Polish-Lithuanians had that part, and either the Russians or the Ottoman Turks had the others. And it's and to see the Poles talk about it so openly, and we're going to recreate colonization by recreating the Polish-Lithuanian Empire by letting Poles hold office in Ukraine. They can just show up and run and hold office. And there's going to be no borders. I'm curious how that's going to work, but I think for those people who don't necessarily want that outcome, they want something more manageable that's more face-saving. They know they got to act now because they're on the clock. They got probably 30 days to get something like that done before Donbass falls. I mean, it may take longer, but it's looking like, that 90-day thereabout timetable, Russia is going to be pretty close to securing all the Donbass plus all of the southern region already that they already have. And then from there, what's going to stop Russia from keep going? I don't think they go to Kiev. I never agreed with that analysis. But I do think they probably go towards Odessa because then they take the rest of the sea. They take what's historically, especially, Putin kind of gave this away when he said, I'm going to decommunize your borders for you. Decommunizing the borders would be that 1922 and 1954 Crimea and southeastern Ukraine. And that again goes back. That was almost never part of the Polish Empire. Poland never went that far into Ukraine. I mean, you had Cossacks who governed there. You had Tatars who governed there. You had Mongols and governed there. You had the Ottoman Turks who governed there. And then, of course, you had the Russians who governed there. Briefly the Nazis for a year or two. But not the rest of that, especially now far western Ukraine. It's a whole different animal. But it looks like Poland's solution is a split Ukraine that basically expands Poland into the rest of there, and then Russia takes the rest. That the Kissinger wing of the deep state probably is not happy with that idea. They would rather Ukraine still exist, still be a player, still be something they can play with from the West that doesn't go through Poland to control or influence. And save face vis-a-vis Russia. Especially, right now the problem is if the goal was to make an example of Russia, of globalist financial monopoly, being able to assert political, social, cultural, military control through that's already lost. But right now, if you got out, let's say within the next 30 days, maybe you could say, it was in a transition phase. It still would have worked in a month or 2 or 3 months or whatever. The longer this goes on, that Russia holds out and that the ruble grows rather than drops, and their internal economic stability, back to our discussion, the 1997 Putin thesis is proven true, the more trouble for the globalists. So I think the smart globalists, the smart deep state operators want an exit ramp now before they're forced on an exit ramp that embarrasses everybody.
I completely agree, and that is logical. That is exactly what they should do. And the point to say is 30 days. Perhaps I would guess that's about the right time. I mean, it's probably going to take less time for the Russians to clear northern Donbass. If northern Donbass collapses, the rest of Donbass follows it because it becomes untenable. And then you can already start to see things begin to move very fast in other places as well. And on the question of the economy, well, the ruble is now at 56 to the dollar. You know, it hit 150 at one point. It's now at 56. So it's continuing to strengthen almost every day. And the sanctions, the sixth package of sanctions that the European Union was planning for, that seems to be at a standstill. Now, coming to Poland, if Poland gets itself involved, if it gets involved in Ukraine, if it starts taking over Western Ukraine, if it starts trying to recreate the Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Rzeczpospolita, I'm going to tell you that a lot of people in Europe are not going to be happy. I suspect a lot of people in Germany are not going to be happy. It won't just be the realists in the deep state in the United States who are not going to be happy with it. I think you'll find lots of people in Germany who already find the Poles difficult to work with. That's putting it mildly. I think that a enlarged Poland getting itself sucked into Ukraine, getting itself into all kinds of historic issues with Russia is going to be a very, very concerning for some people of a realist school in Germany. And that may be why the Green ministers, the Habeck and Baerbock, are now starting to sound extremely shrill. Robert Habeck, who's Germany's unbelievable, I mean, I find him the most incredible individual that has ever held ministerial rank in any European country. Robert Habeck was at Davos. Quite extraordinary to think that, you know, for me, historically, remembering the old Green Party as it was when it was established, the idea of the founder of the Green Party, the German Green Party, Petra Kelly, ever going to Davos is just, except as a protester, is, you know, is extraordinary to think Green politicians going to Davos. But anyway, they are. And he sounded, I thought, borderline hysterical. He was talking about, you know, he can't recognize Europe anymore, that there's betrayals on every front. Hungary is, you know, not doing the right thing. The worst of Europe is on show. I mean, this kind of language, deeply offensive to many people, very typical of a student activist. If you're not with me, you must be a scoundrel. I mean, that's basically his sort of line. And everybody who's, you know, disagreeing with me must be disagreeing because they have some self-interested reason for disagreeing. So Orban wants to continue with his partnership with Putin. That was another thing that Habeck said. Well, those people like Habeck, Baerbock, and the rest, if they read the New York Times editorial, if they are listening to what Kissinger says, if they are getting a sense that the political sands in Washington are shifting, they must be extremely worried for themselves. Because make no mistake about it, if US changes course on Ukraine, if somebody in the United States makes a decision that this has gone far enough, if what this congressman, I'm not sure whether he's a serving congressman, Tim Cantor, apparently said in Davos that the United States is in danger of overplaying its hand and must now pull back. If that happens, then the position of people like Baerbock, Habeck, and the rest becomes untenable in Germany and in Europe. And to be straightforward about it, the political reaction in Germany, after all they put Germany through, would be so strong that I very much doubt that the Greens will ever be in government in Germany again. So for them, this is a very high stakes thing now. Now, I absolutely agree with what you were saying about the situation on the ground. I think that is what is driving it. There were two aspects to this conflict. One was the economic war, and this, the Biden people like Habeck, Baerbock, Johnson in Britain, they all expected that they would win it quickly. And we know that. We know that was their plan because, foolishly, the people in the White House actually went around at the time when they imposed the sanctions on the central bank, and they bragged about it. They're on record as saying that they were going to force the ruble to go into free fall, that they were going to create an inflationary crisis in Russia, that they were going to drain the country of its foreign reserves, that they were going to cripple its economy. And it wasn't just in the US. You had the French finance minister, Le Drian, saying exactly the same thing, that they were going to destroy the Russian economy. So that's not working. That's not going to plan. The other side was the war. Now, they didn't expect the war to go on as long as it has, because they thought that with the Russian economy imploding in March, it wouldn't need to go as long as it has. They thought that Russia would implode, there'd be a political crisis, they'd be able to sort it out, they'd be able to dictate terms. Well, it hasn't worked out like that. So they find themselves in a situation, in a war, where they're getting concerned that the Ukrainian army is being encircled and destroyed in eastern Donbass. And if people have been following all our channels, Robert's channel, our channel on the Duran, we were saying right from the start that the Russians have a Clausewitzian approach to war. They're not interested in capturing ground or cities. They're interested in destroying the opponent's army, thereby undermining their opponent's will and ability to keep fighting. And that is what they're coming increasingly close to doing, at least within sight of doing in eastern Ukraine. And I think, again, the penny has dropped. People are starting to see it. There's a shift, a major shift in mood in London. I was just looking at the Telegraph again. Now, the Telegraph is the reliable voice of the British Defence Ministry. And we see headline. This is the headline. That's the current headline. Russia seizes initiative in battle for the Donbass. That's what the Daily Telegraph is saying. That's not what they were saying a week ago. They've suddenly changed. The mood has changed. It's not yet panic. They've not yet reached the point of panic. But the more realistic amongst them is now saying the Americans are changing their minds. Time that we did too. We've got to find a way out. More difficult for us to do in Britain because our political system is stagnant. Whatever you may say about the US, you have a vital politics. I mean, there's people like Josh Hawley, there's people like, any number of people in the US, Rand Paul, people on the left, people on the right. There's active real politics in the United States. In Britain, we have lost that skill. Our politics are stagnant. Our politics are frozen. So it's very difficult to find somebody who isn't compromised and who can come forward and start to change course. But if America changes course, make no mistake about it, we will. We will follow where America leads, as we always do.
Robert, Alexander, real quick. Hungary's Orban declares a state of emergency over war and economy. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, this is from Bloomberg, declared a wartime state of emergency immediately after his new government was installed. The state of emergency, a new tool Parliament approved earlier on Tuesday, will take effect at midnight and will give the government, quote, maneuvering room and the ability to react immediately to the fallout from the war in neighboring Ukraine. Orban said in a video message on his Facebook page, the government will announce its first measures under the emergency on Wednesday, he said. That's the article. Is kind of breaking news. Robert, what do you think? Alexander, what do you think of this?
A couple of things. I mean, I'm not a fan of emergency powers by any government, even Orban, who, I mean, I like Orban, the only sensible European leader, arguably, that's in the EU at least. But not a fan of emergency powers. But this is Orban counteracting a whole bunch of things going on. So I understand why, just not a big fan of the emergency power aspect. Similar to the super chat question, I mean, part of actually the heart of Banderite Ukrainian nationalism comes from a part of Ukraine that was often part of the Austrian Empire, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they were actually okay during that stage, is when they got put in with the Poles, that was their main target. So, like, all this brotherhood talk is interesting. It's like, I get it. Like, the Poles dominated Western Ukraine for about 400 years, from the middle of the 14th century to the 17th, 18th century. But I don't know if that was brotherhood in the Ukrainian sense of the word, at least, because Banderites didn't exactly, their idea of brotherhood was to blow people up, kidnap the postmen, engage in massive terrorism campaigns. They targeted the Poles long before they targeted the Russians. That part of Ukraine, I don't think was hardly ever within the Russian Empire, ever. It was, I mean, in fact, you can go all the way back. It had there was at one point its own country called Galicia, its own territory during beginning of the Mongol invasions. Kiev was separate, as the Principality of Kiev was separate from it. But these people do think of themselves as Ukrainian, or Ukrainian nationalists, but they think of themselves originally, when this group of people from Western Ukraine came to the United States and set up the first Ukrainian Nationalist Association, and it would become the center of all Ukrainian nationalist associations throughout all of North and Latin America. It has ideological influence to this day, which is striking. But when they started off, they didn't call themselves Ukrainian. They called themselves Ruthenian. And that's because from that part of Western Ukraine, basically they saw themselves as the inheritors of the Kievan Rus. Ruthenian is just another word for Russian. Ukrainian just means borderlander. Kind of still, I find it a weird nationality. I'm a borderlander. Okay, whatever. But that group of people, they started out as Ruthenians before, even in America in the late 1800s, before they switched to Ukrainian as a label. But there was a piece there. There's some Hungarian piece there. I don't think Orban's eager to grab a piece of Ukraine. That's just my take. But yes, a different Hungarian leader might. Yes, there's a Romanian part. I mean, there was parts of that the parts of Ukraine that have some overlap with Romania, that border Romania. Also you have Moldova, of course, that's inside Ukraine's borders, that Romania thinks it has certain attachment to. Let's put it that way. And then you go all the way back. That was part of the Greater Bulgarian Empire, going all the way back. So there's history of that region being kind of in dispute, you might say, not part of the rest of Ukraine, which was totally different and separate with its history. But also to Alexander's point, it's the utility of predictability about what happened economically and militarily and politically. Because when I first had conversations in late February, early March with a bunch of with Senate candidates, House candidates, congressional staff members, think tank types, media folks, people close to Trump, my ace in the hole was being able to predict what we had predicted. Because if I was able to be accurate, say, here's what you're going to see over the next 30, 60, 90 days. And if we were more accurate, or if I was more accurate in talking to them than what the New York Times was saying, the Wall Street Journal was saying, all the think tanks were saying, all the foundation people, all the social media experts from the Army intelligence. I think I said to you, these guys are still delusional. I mean, it's incredible reading their stuff. It's like, where do these people live? But they were predicting an entirely different thing. And there were a lot of political actors that weren't willing to take a gamble if Russia was going to collapse in 30 days anyway. Weren't going to take a gamble if Ukraine was going to win easy in the military conflict. Weren't willing to take a gamble if the whole global South was going to be against Russia. Weren't willing to take a gamble if the domestic populace would respond in a way as favorable to the U.S. position rather than adversarial to the U.S. position vis-a-vis the Biden administration. And on all four, my prediction was that the economy, or what I told him was, here's what you'll see over the next 30, 60, 90 days. This economic gamble won't work. Putin's 1997 thesis as a grad student is right. Food and fuel. This is, by the way, used to be a Kissinger quote. He who controls the food, he who controls the fuel. Now, Kissinger thought he who controls the money controls it all. He turned out he's wrong about that third premise. The first two were right. The third one was wrong. And that's what Putin's gamble was in 1997. control food, control fuel, you'll be self-sufficient. You have real security. And so my analysis was, what our analysis was Russia will be just fine. Russia doesn't depend on food. Russia's not Venezuela or Cuba. Russia does not depend on outside sources for food, does not depend on outside sources for fuel. And consequently, and in fact, relies on outside sources for almost nothing but luxury goods and certain manufactured items for the most part. All things they could really replace pretty quickly within the daily economy of the ordinary Russian. Their rent's not going to go up. Their petrol bill's not going to go up there. It's not like Britain. It's like Europe. All of a sudden, 5-fold increases, 10-fold increases. That wasn't going to happen there because they got their own. Being able to predict that was what was going to happen rather than what all the deep state crowd was saying, predicted militarily Russia would not try to take all of Ukraine. Like nobody wanted to be on the Russian side or say anything against the Biden administration if it was true that Putin was going to march through Ukraine and try to go to Poland, right? Said that's never going to happen. And that whatever happens early on, they often do multiple fronts. You can't pay attention. The focus is going to be Donbass. Look at what happened with South Ossetia. Imagine South Ossetia plus. They'll add a little bit more, but it'll be the historic lands that they had going all the way back to the 1700s. And the fact that is what ultimately took place rather than what Milley and everyone else was predicting was going to happen militarily, and that the Ukrainians couldn't hold on long term. And then the political dynamic is the global South would not join, and that all the things the critics were saying, that these are a bunch of neo-Nazis and Zelensky's a grifter, you don't want to be anywhere near these people, it'll be embarrassing over time. Increasingly, they're getting to witness in live time. These Nazis, they can't help themselves. They're always filming stuff. I mean, apparently they filmed some of their torture stuff and kept their phones so that, I guess it looks like maybe the Azov Battalion people told them this was a special project. It's not really a surrender. Don't worry. Then they hop on, the meme is they hop on the bus and they turn to see who's driving it, and it's Putin. And like, hold on a second. But apparently they took their phones with them that shows their crimes. It's like, I don't know what genius that is. But if you're watching from the West, you see more and more evidence of the neo-Nazis. You see more and more evidence that Zelensky is just an obvious kleptocratic grifter who's playing a role so he can cash out in Hollywood. You're seeing the wrong people be associated with this. If you're on the populist right, you don't want to be on the same side as Sean Penn and Angelina Jolie or the World Economic. The fact the World Economic Forum is cheering this conflict is going to further undermine its appeal within the American populist right. It will further remind them, oh, we're right to be nowhere near this thing. And because all of those predictions are coming true is why the populist right is being more vocal, being more verbal. Now, think tanks want to be part of it. Now, more elected representatives want to be part of it. More institutional actors want to be part of it. And Trump has pretty much really committed to that. He has not said anything pro-war since he issued that statement about peace now. Once we won over Trump, once the populist right won over Trump on this, that meant it was only a matter of time before everybody else started falling in on the right. So I think that because of what's happened is why the American political electorate's moving the way it does. That in turn is moving the way the deep state is now divided. And I agree that whatever happens in the American deep state is it's the way Europe will follow. Even though, Ursula von Crazy would love to do her own thing. But, I don't think realistically can. And it looks like Boris is on his last legs. He keeps surviving, but looks like he may finally be on his last legs in Britain because I don't know how much the Brits are willing to keep writing higher and higher checks for a failed war in Ukraine.
That is exactly true. Let's just talk about Orban. Now, this may be connected. This decision to declare a state of emergency may be connected to the fact that he's in a major round now with the European Union. I mean, I mentioned Robert Habeck and how Robert Habeck at Davos criticized Orban in ferocious terms. But just earlier today, we got news that Orban has ruled out any discussion at the European Council meeting. Now, the European Council meeting, just to say, is the meeting that brings together heads of state and government of the European Union. It's the key decision-making body, and it has to work on most things, on some things, certainly on sanctions. It has to work by consensus. So Orban has a veto. Anyway, he's already made it clear in a letter to Charles Michel, who is the president of the European Council, that he is not prepared to discuss an oil embargo of Russia at the next European Council meeting. He says that European proposals for an oil embargo are far too vague, and that if they are implemented in their current form, or indeed one suspects in any form, that would result in a major crisis for the Hungarian economy, which he's not prepared to accept or allow. So now, if you're in Orban's position, you have to be aware of the fact that you've got the EU Council against you, most of the EU apparatus is against you, Germany's against you, Habeck is talking about, how you go in partnership with Putin, the French, the Italian government, Mario Draghi, all those people are against you, and the ally you relied upon, Poland, which shares your views on many things about the EU integration, well, that's now gone off on a frolic of its own. They're interested in Ukraine. They're talking about Galicia. They've got this crazy policy against Russia. So you can't rely on Poland anymore. So you may be facing disruptions from the EU targeting your economy, targeting you specifically. They might not be as dangerous as an oil embargo, but they might, for example, cut off EU funding, which is substantial. It's one of these many slush funds the European Union has, the so-called structural funds, for example, that go into various countries, go to various regions to support economies there, to build roads, to do all those kind of infrastructure things. The EU's been threatening to cut that off from countries that are non-compliant with EU policies and regulations. Now, they will not link it. If the EU cuts off funding, they will not link it to Orban opposing an oil embargo, because that would be too obviously a political thing. But they will root out, they will look for something else that they can say that Orban, Hungary, is in non-compliance with EU laws and regulations. So we're going to cut off funding to them. So I think this is a preemptive move by Orban. He's taking this very strong line on the oil embargo. He's taking this preemptive move. He's imposing this equivalent of a state of emergency. Like Robert, I loathe emergency powers. I think they are the most insidious and dangerous things to do in situations that are short of war. I mean, what they are all about ultimately is ways of doing away with due process, doing away with legal procedure, doing away with all the right things that should happen in a peaceful civil society. But this is why I think he's doing it, because he anticipates that next month there's going to be a concerted attack on him by the EU leadership. And with Robert Habeck's statements at Davos highlighting the dangers for him and for Hungary. Now, the other thing is, I have to say this, at least Orban is taking steps. At least he's sitting down. He's saying, I'm going to have these emergency powers. You may disagree with emergency powers, as I do, but at least he's sitting down. He's talking with his ministers. He's discussing things with his officials. He's strategizing about what to do in any given situation, given the kind of problems that might be thrown at Hungary. We are in an economic crisis in Europe. We're in an economic crisis in Britain. To be very clear, we are in a much worse position economically than the US is. I mean, the US is a continental economy. Contrary to what most people think, yes, the US imports a lot, but basically, overall, it's self-sufficient. It can get by. We in Europe are not in that position. And we in Britain, most especially, are definitely not. Are we strategizing? Are we sitting down? Are we saying to each other, what must we do? How are we going to resolve these problems? How are we going to keep the factories running? How are we going to keep people warm? How are we going to get the food in the shops? How are we going to prevent unemployment exploding? Are we doing any of those things? We're not. We are doing nothing. Here in Britain, it is terrible to see. All we're doing at the moment in Britain is we're simply printing more money, and we do not have the world's reserve currency in the way that the United States does. So that is what we are doing. We are not strategizing. We are not taking preemptive steps to prepare for the hard times which are to come. We are in denial about them. And of course, if we're Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock, I sometimes get the impression that these people do not like industry. They do not like modern industrial manufacturing. They would, frankly, almost at a visceral level, not be too sorry if it was all to go away, because after all, well, they're Greens, and doing that will save the planet. So I'm sorry that sounds a bit cynical and extreme, but I do wonder sometimes when I listen to these people whether they really do think that way.
To what degree do you guys, how hard would it be for Hungary or any of these other countries to exit the EU? Because, like, I mean, two things are happening. One is the EU, it seems to me, has been a failed experiment, but it seems like everybody feels they're locked in. It's like they feel like exiting is not an option other than Britain. And maybe it's the currency issue because Britain never went on the euro. And maybe that's what's got them stuck. Kind of. But like when these kind of things happen, it seems like it would be in Hungary's interest, at least theoretically, to exit the EU and not be part of this nonsense anymore. What are some of the hurdles practical to that? And then do you think this internal finger pointing is going to continue to escalate? Because you look at the EU finger pointing at Hungary. You have Turkey saying we're not getting in the middle of a finger pointing match. We're going to maintain our relations with Russia. Erdogan's doing his constant, dance. But pretty clear he's going to, I mean, the way he trolled Sweden and Finland and, you can join NATO if you send one of your ministers down and just extradite him for a crime because we don't like him. I mean, that's not and my understanding of NATO, it has to be by consensus. I think if anyone objects, no one can join. I mean, there's talk of, is my understanding. Looking at the legal document, it's kind of a little bit odd. It just says by consensus. Normally you would say by unanimity, but it doesn't actually quite make that clear. But so it's not clear to me Sweden and Finland will be joining NATO. But and then you have the statements that Poland made about Norway, saying, "Hey, you greedy SOBs, you're making all this money off oil. You should, send us some of that extra cash." This is a lot of internal finger pointing in Europe. And all because they're wanting to fight over some part that's not part of the EU. It's not part of NATO. It's a little insane. But how much do you think the finger pointing will continue to escalate internally within Europe? And what is the hurdles to countries like Hungary getting out of the EU?
Right. Let's deal with the last point. Let's talk about Hungary leaving the EU. They are, in my opinion, purely psychological. Yes, Hungary does get a lot of support through the structural funds. Yes, there are trading connections between Hungary and the rest of the EU. Remember, it's a small country. It's a small economy. But I actually think, personally, that Hungary would be able to thrive outside the EU, and it can do it. It's still got its monetary independence. It is able to leave the EU with its economy intact, just as Britain was. It can forge connections with other countries, with Russia first and foremost. Massive potential market there, and China too. Hungary can do it.
Serbia.
It can probably do it. Serbia, it can do it faster actually than Britain can, because as it's a smaller economy, it can turn things around faster. There are problems, but they are psychological. Hungarians think of themselves very much as Europeans. They think of themselves very much as a bastion, a fortress of Catholic Christian Europe. They fought the Ottomans very heroically for centuries. They felt that they'd been detached from Europe, their conception of Europe during the Cold War, because they were, under the Soviet yoke. So psychologically, it's very difficult for many Hungarians to say we leave the EU. But to be absolutely clear, that is all that is holding them back in practical terms. Now, if you are a member of the Eurozone, if you are within the single currency, then it becomes, as we know to our cost in Greece, vastly more difficult. Firstly, you are under the heel of the European Central Bank because, in the run-up to any decision to leave the EU, they can do all kinds of things. They can screw up your banks. They can block, money coming through your system. They can seize money in your system. I mean, Alex can tell you all about that. It happened to him in Cyprus. They did it there. So they can put on incredible pressures. And of course, the fear that many people have in these countries, it was very real in Greece, especially amongst older people who are paid their pensions in euros, is that, of course, if you quit the Eurozone, if you come out of the Eurozone and your money is converted from the euro into the local currency, which in Greece would have been the drachma will immediately depreciate massively and your pension will be worth far less, perhaps nothing. And that keeps people afraid and it makes them stay. So that's the thing. The Eurozone is the prison. If you're outside the Eurozone, you can leave. And it's not so hard. If you're in the Eurozone, unless you're a big country, unless you're France, and even for France, it would be difficult. It would be traumatic. Or at least that's what we all think. Alex can provide you details about what happened to him in Cyprus, how he woke up one day and found that all his money in the bank had been taken away from him. Do you want to just explain that to our viewers?
No, I mean, I'm just going off of what you said and what Robert said. It's the Eurozone. It's the euro, the money. That's what holds the countries in. I mean, they shut off your ATM, Robert, just like that. I mean,
yes.
You wake up one morning and all the ATMs, no more money. We've gone into your bank and that's it. But they did give, it was Schäuble. Schäuble did give Greece an off-ramp.
Yes.
He said, Greece, you can leave the Eurozone. We'll give you 50 billion euros, 5 years, get out. Yeah. Germany, there was a part of Germany that did not want Greece in the Eurozone. And Schäuble, the finance minister at the time, he did give Greece an off-ramp, and Greece said, no, we want to stay.
Yeah.
We want that currency. So I think Hungary could easily make it out. And I think Hungary-Serbia could be an interesting play. I mean, Hungary is landlocked, but there could be some alliances there. I don't know. I don't know what you guys think, but I think Hungary could make it.
I think Hungary could make it. I mean, I absolutely it could make it. And of course, but as I said, there is this issue that, they find it very difficult to imagine themselves out of Europe. And one of the terrible things that's happened is the way in which the concept of Europe has been fused in political speak with the European Union. So we act as if the two are one and the same. So that's where I think Hungary's problems are. But anyway, that's I think the politics in Hungary. That's why Orban has done this dramatic thing, why he's decided to impose these emergency rules, because he anticipates an attack coming. But it's not going to come from Moscow. It's not going to come from Washington. It's going to come from Brussels and to some extent from Berlin.
And I assume Brussels is eager to do so because they're still unhappy that he won by the margin he won in the first place.
Absolutely.
They spent all that effort, and he, of course, called him out in his victory speech explicitly. So that wouldn't, but it shows, I think it's the same here in the United States. This sort of Tucker Carlson had a rant about it, that what we're seeing in a lot of policies by whether you call them neoliberals or the Democratic political establishment, however you label them internally here, it's the failure of their policies is leading to crazier policies. And that, in the sense, like what you guys are describing in Europe, is the failure of this attack, this using Ukraine to end Russia, is leading to Poland arguing with Norway, Turkey trying to keep Sweden and Finland out, EU waging war against Orban because he's the one dissident member. Even though my understanding also on NATO is that for their own reasons, Croatia doesn't want certain countries added because of where that might lead. But so in the U.S., similarly, I mean, Tucker's rant was that the failure of liberal policies is leading to what he called rage, just kind of almost insane set of policies, but that policies that are getting sort of worse and more disconnected and disattenuated from reality. And that's in part what's happening. I think that like the Kissinger wing of the deep state that wants to get out of this doesn't want to go down the self-destructive path that these other groups are on. And it's very much it's our way, or if it's not our way, we blow it all up. I mean, it's almost like that kind of mindset mentality. Like the summer of love, which was more like the summer of rage of 2020, is almost like the natural next step for a lot of these crowds that are not getting what they want. They're not getting what they want in the disinformation governance board. They're not getting what they want, and that they're also the neoliberal Americans. Some people asked, "What's a neoliberal, neoconservative?" I call them these days, since the mid '90s, and particularly through Hillary Clinton, that it's really globalist versus nationalist more often than anything else. What it is neoliberal, neoconservative for people who grew up in the '90s is a quick proxy for warmongers. Is the easiest way to describe it. They're people who like intervention, who like using military, political, financial means to get involved in other people's lives. And neoliberal was just they did it in the name of the liberal rules of order or whatever nonsense was their self-justification, self-rationalization, whereas neocons were more seen as doing it in the name of American freedom, American security, sort of American empire, leveraging America as a global example to the world through force, military or financial. And that's heavily the neocon phrase all the way back was, ex-commies basically, who flipped in the 70s, Irving Kristol and others, and it was represented a small little intellectual group. Over time, it's represented everybody who sees war or foreign intervention as a useful means to some political objective, either of themselves or of a globalist order. I consider it more globalist because this is when people on the left call it an empire, American empire. It's one of the weirdest empires ever. It's an empire that impoverishes the domestic population and kills off the domestic population. Popular empires bring home treasure and limit the amount of blood loss. They don't increase the amount of blood loss and reduce the domestic treasure. That's what this so-called empire does. I consider it more of a globalist project aligned with George Soros's ideas than aligned with anything American. Looks a lot more like George Soros than Teddy Roosevelt, put it that way. And so and that's where that alignment is. But within, the domestic policies within the U.S. are just increasingly like, if this was a strategy, let's have a Ukrainian conflict, prove that we're still the shining example of liberty and freedom and democracy and whatever, and Zelensky is the new magical beacon. He's the Nelson Mandela of Europe. That kind of imagery that they're trying to build up, idolatry, really. If that was the goal to boost Biden, it hasn't worked. Biden's ratings keep going down, 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 and down. And they probably made a mistake by blaming any economic conditions on this conflict. Because you can look through almost all of human history. And if a war will not be popular with a local population if it increases the risk to their well-being and decreases their pocketbook. Realistically, when wars have been popular domestically, it's when they think they're really necessary to defend themselves. The Great War in Russia, as they call it, the World War II for them, the Great Patriotic War. That is popular to this day because they defended themselves in their view. Pretty good, clearly did defend themselves. And then the other, like the old Vikings, the old Mongols, the old Romans, the old empires, it increased the wealth of the domestic community. It was the British Empire was perceived as increasing the wealth of the domestic community, not costing them it, not costing money. I mean, that's kind of like Trump in his own, brutally blunt realpolitik way. It's like, if we're not getting the oil, why are we going? What's the deal? Right? I mean, that's that kind of mentality of how does this benefit us? These conflicts don't. And by reminding everybody, calling it Putin's price hike, like Jennifer Granholm did in front of Josh Hawley to his irritation, all that did is, one, remind Republicans they should not be on board with this war because it'll be used as a pretext and excuse for all of Biden's mistakes. It was a reminder of that. But the other is, it reminds the American public that to the degree they are unhappy with current economic conditions, they can blame Biden's decision to get involved in this conflict. I mean, that's why it was a mistake. It wasn't like people were going to go, Putin's price hike. Oh, I hate you, Putin. I'm now more for the war because I have to pay more for gas. Like, that was the mindset of the people who promoted that, who pitched that. That was never going to translate to the ordinary American voter. I mean, like, why the heck am I paying something because of something with Ukraine? Oh, that makes no sense to me. And the polling, when you dug in from day one, showed that people were not willing to pay a higher price to support the effort, whether that was a higher price and risk of war with Russia, whether that was higher price in the form of American soldiers on the ground, or a higher price in terms of real dollars. The reason why Mitch McConnell had to rush that through the Senate, aside from not letting Rand Paul impose an inspector general to show it's a real deep state money grab, was because it's not popular. And he had to rush it through so it didn't gestate amongst the American public for very long. Because you could tell within the social media world, this was an extremely unpopular bill. Even people who don't care one way or the other about the Ukrainian conflict were like, why are we sending $40 billion to anybody rather than spending it here? Foreign aid has never been popular in the United States outside of emergencies like hurricanes. And, even then, that money, look at what happened to Haiti. That money didn't end up in the Haitians' hands. It ended up in the Clintons' hands and some other places. And Haitian kids ended up on some orphans ended up on some involuntary trips to Epstein Island. So or its equivalent. So I think that's the kind of, the same thing's happening domestically. Biden is sinking like a rock. We have a bunch of primaries today here in the States. In Georgia, it looks like Kemp will win, which will be a slight blow to Trump. But Ratberger, the Secretary of State, I think may lose. I was opposite him on a lot of the Trump election litigation. Patrick Witt, may win. Some Trumpists may win. Marjorie Taylor Greene probably will win her primary safely. And in Texas, it may mean the end of the Bush family, at least temporarily. Abe Bush has held elected office every single year since 1981. And if you go further back to the family chain, they've held office at some level, like going back to the late 1800s at some point between the two family trees. George P. Bush, he was considered the future because he was half Latino. So he was Jorge Bush, right? He's another George Bush. So he's in the George Bush family tradition name, but he was Jorge Bush. So, that was their process of how we'll get this is why they were pro-immigration. They thought this was the key to the Bush family political legacy.